Under the soft glow of London's late evening street lamps, a storm was brewing, one that would not stay confined to whispered phone calls or sealed court papers. It was the kind of story that could split public opinion down the middle, the kind that left people staring at their screens with their mouths slightly open, muttering, "She didn't actually do that, did she?" It began, as many scandals do, not in front of cameras or on a red carpet, but in a quiet, private room where promises were made, hands were shaken, and a deal was struck that, at the time, seemed like the perfect arrangement. The woman at the center of this storm was not a palisade, a celebrity friend, or even a member of Meghan Markle's inner circle. She was, by all accounts, an ordinary woman with an extraordinary task. For months, she had lived in the shadow of secrecy, carrying what she claimed was Meghan Markle's child, bound by a contract worth $500,000. It wasn't just the money. It was the security, the assurances, the understanding that her role would be respected and her effort rewarded. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But if her version of events is to be believed, somewhere between the initial smiles and the final days of her commitment, something went horribly wrong. Payments that had been promised allegedly stopped. Conversations that had once been warm turned cold and terse. And slowly, this surrogate, once silent, bound by legal obligation and personal hope, began to realize that the safety net she thought she had was nothing more than paper. The first sign to the public that something was amiss did not come from the palace or from a headline in a glossy magazine. It came from a subtle, almost cryptic post on a private social media account. A single sentence, accompanied by a blurred photo of what looked like a legal contract. When someone owes you $500,000 and thinks you'll just walk away. Those words spread quickly, first among her friends, then through whispers in online forums, until the connection was made. Whispers that the unnamed woman might be tied to Meghan Markle. By the time journalists began circling, the story had grown claws. Questions exploded. Was Meghan involved in a surrogacy deal? If so, why was there a contract dispute? And perhaps most damaging of all, why was a woman publicly claiming the Duchess had failed to honor a massive financial agreement? It was the kind of narrative that could not be neatly brushed aside by a polished PR statement. To understand how it reached this point, you have to step back into the world Meghan inhabits, a world where every move is calculated, where alliances are formed and broken over dinner conversations, and where reputation is both currency and weapon. In this sphere, a $500,000 contract might seem like a straightforward transaction, but in reality, it's a web of legal language, unspoken expectations, and power dynamics that rarely favor the less famous party. The surrogate side of the story begins with a cautious optimism. She describes being approached discreetly, her qualifications and background vetted extensively. There was talk of privacy, of trust, of ensuring that this arrangement would be handled with dignity. The figure on the table, $500,000, was not just payment. It was a promise that the emotional and physical toll of the journey would be met with fairness. But contracts, no matter how airtight they appear, are still written by people. And people, especially in the throes of ambition, can change their minds. Somewhere along the way, according to the surrogate, Meghan's focus shifted. The warmth in her messages cooled, replaced by curt replies and, eventually, silence. It wasn't just about money. It was about respect. It was about the feeling of being treated as a disposable service rather than a human being fulfilling an extraordinary commitment. For Meghan, if her camp's denials are to be believed, this entire narrative is either exaggerated or outright fabricated. Her supporters point to the relentless stream of accusations she's faced since stepping away from royal duties, suggesting this is just another attempt to smear her name. They note that no official court records, at least initially, tied her directly to the surrogate's claims. Yet the absence of formal proof did little to calm the waters, because in the world of celebrity scandal, perception often matters more than documented fact. The public's fascination wasn't just about whether Meghan had actually withheld payment. It was about what the story symbolized. The clash between two women from vastly different worlds, bound together by an arrangement that should have been clear-cut, but instead became a tangle of mistrust and alleged betrayal. One side saw a broken promise, The other saw a dangerous attack on reputation. And then came the tipping point. The surrogate agreed to speak on record, not to a tabloid eager for sensation, but to a measured, credible outlet. In that interview, she laid out her version with calm precision. She described the terms of the contract, the agreed-upon payment schedule, the initial installments that arrived on time, and the abrupt halt in communication when the final sum was due. She spoke of unanswered emails, legal threats she claimed came from Meghan's representatives, and the personal toll of feeling both exploited and silenced. The reaction was immediate. Social media lit up, not just with the usual polarized debates, but with a flood of questions about surrogacy laws, contractual ethics, and the murky space where celebrity privilege meets private agreements. Was this a breach of contract, or was there more to the story? Could Meghan's team have had a legitimate reason to withhold payment? Or was the surrogate, as Meghan's defenders argued, using the public stage to pressure her into compliance? As the world watched, the story morphed from a niche dispute into a full-blown media storm. Every detail, real, rumored, or imagined, was dissected. Analysts debated on talk shows. Lawyers gave their takes in op-eds. And all the while, Meghan's silence, whether strategic or defensive, only fueled the sense that something bigger was coming. The introduction to this saga is not about deciding who is right. It is about setting the stage for a high-stakes confrontation where truth and perception wrestle in public view. It is about the layers of power, money, and trust that form the backdrop to a story now too big to contain. And it is about the single question hanging over it all. What really happened between Meghan Markle and the woman who says she carried her child? This is not the kind of story that ends quietly. As we move deeper, we will peel back the timelines, the evidence, the motivations, and the consequences. But for now, the lines are drawn, the players are in place, and the first shot has been fired in a battle that could redefine not just Meghan's public image, but the way we think about celebrity agreements in the age of instant global exposure. If you're ready to see how this unfolds, keep watching, because every chapter ahead will take us closer to the heart of the storm. It began in a world that prided itself on control. Meghan Markle's life, even before her entry into the royal family, had been carefully curated. The right appearances, the right causes, the right narrative. After stepping away from royal duties, that control was even more essential. Every public word, every image, every partnership was weighed for maximum benefit and minimal risk. Yet behind the curtain of her public image, there were decisions and arrangements that could never be packaged neatly for the public. One of those was the alleged surrogacy deal. For the woman chosen for this arrangement, the approach was discreet, almost cinematic. A mutual contact, someone she trusted implicitly, had reached out with what was described as an opportunity of a lifetime. The language was deliberate. It was a privilege, not just a job. The surrogate recalled being told she had been personally selected because she met certain criteria: discretion, proven medical history, and a temperament that could handle pressure. She was warned that this would not be a simple 9 months. This was about helping one of the most scrutinized women on earth. At first, she was skeptical. Celebrities were known to be unpredictable clients, especially when contracts were involved. But the mutual contact painted a picture of a fair, mutually beneficial arrangement. The payment, $500,000, was more than she could have imagined. It was life-changing. The contract, she was told, would ensure her medical needs were met, her privacy respected, and her time fairly compensated. The first meeting between Meghan and the surrogate was, according to the surrogate's account, surprisingly warm. Meghan was attentive, speaking about family, the importance of trust, and her gratitude for the surrogate's willingness to take on such a role. She allegedly spoke of her own struggles, hinting at private medical issues, but without going into detail. There was a sense of shared humanity in that conversation, the surrogate recalled. It was not the polished Meghan from interviews or documentaries, but someone candid, direct, and capable of making you feel seen. The contract itself was intricate. Beyond the payment schedule, it outlined expectations that went beyond the usual surrogacy agreements. There were clauses about travel restrictions, diet, and even wardrobe. Public appearances were to be avoided unless cleared by Meghan's representatives. The surrogate was to have no contact with journalists or anyone who could leak details. Each term was explained as a necessity for protecting privacy. The surrogate signed willingly, believing that the demands were part of the package when dealing with a public figure of Meghan's stature. The early days of the arrangement went smoothly. Payments were made on time, the medical care was top-notch, and Meghan's team checked in regularly. The surrogate described receiving thoughtful gifts, organic skincare products, handwritten notes, even books Meghan thought she would enjoy. It was, at that stage, exactly what she had been promised. But the first hint of strain appeared during the second trimester. A payment that was due arrived late. At first, the delay was explained away as a banking issue, the sort of thing that happens when large sums cross international borders. The surrogate didn't think much of it. Yet she began to notice that Meghan's tone and messages had shifted. The warmth was still there, but now it was tempered by a sense of busyness, of distance. Communications that once came directly from Meghan began to be filtered through assistants. By the third trimester, the cracks widened. Payments, though still arriving, were inconsistent in timing. Questions about certain medical expenses were met with requests for more documentation. Meghan's team, according to the surrogate, began questioning whether some costs were essential or above what was agreed. These exchanges, while still polite, carried an undertone of mistrust. The surrogate, bound by contract, kept her concerns quiet. She believed that once the arrangement was fulfilled, everything would settle. But she also began documenting everything. The messages, the dates payments were received, the expenses questioned. It was not paranoia, she said, but precaution. She knew enough about the world Meghan inhabited to understand that power and influence could make truth a slippery thing. In those final weeks, the atmosphere was different. The excitement that had marked the early stages had evaporated. Meghan was reportedly more focused on other projects, media deals, public appearances, and ongoing disputes with the press. The surrogate became just one more item on a long to-do list. Still, she reminded herself that the contract was binding. The amount agreed upon was clear, and once her part was complete, she would receive what was owed. When the time came, the delivery was handled with clinical efficiency. Meghan's representatives ensured privacy, security, and discretion. The surrogate did her part, fulfilling every requirement laid out in the agreement. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe it was over, that she could walk away with the promised payment and put the entire experience behind her. But then came the silence. The final payment, the largest installment, never arrived. Days turned into weeks, and the only responses she received were from assistants citing processing delays or pending reviews. Her inquiries about the status of the payment were met with increasingly vague answers. At first, she thought it was a temporary administrative hiccup. Then she began to suspect something else entirely. She reached out to the mutual contact who had introduced her to Meghan's team, hoping they could mediate. Instead, she was told that Meghan was reviewing whether certain contractual obligations had been met to her satisfaction. This was the first time the surrogate had heard of any dissatisfaction. She was stunned. She had followed the rules, undergone every check, maintained absolute silence. The idea that she had failed to meet the terms felt like an invention designed to avoid paying her. That was the moment the arrangement turned toxic. The surrogate realized she was not just dealing with a private dispute. She was up against a public figure with significant resources, a loyal support base, and the ability to shape narratives. Her $500,000 payment wasn't just late. It was, she feared, being withheld deliberately. The tension was no longer hidden in polite exchanges. The emails became curt, the calls brief, and any mention of the contract was met with legal jargon. Meghan herself had vanished from the conversation entirely, replaced by lawyers and assistants. The warmth of that first meeting was a distant memory. In private, the surrogate wrestled with the dilemma: accept the loss and walk away quietly, or risk going public and facing the backlash that inevitably came when accusing someone as polarizing as Meghan Markle. She knew the latter would invite scrutiny into her own life, every choice dissected by strangers. But she also knew that walking away meant letting go of a promise that had been central to why she agreed to the arrangement in the first place. This was no longer just about money. It was about the principle of being treated with fairness and respect, even by those who lived in the gilded world of celebrity privilege. And as she weighed her options, she began to see a path forward, one that would shift the balance of power in this conflict. The perfect arrangement had become a chess game, and the surrogate was about to make her first bold move. From the beginning, the contract had been presented as a mutual safeguard. Meghan's representatives emphasized that it was there to protect both parties, to guarantee the surrogate's well-being, and to shield Meghan from the intrusion and chaos that could erupt if news of the arrangement ever leaked. At face value, it looked like a professional, watertight agreement. But buried in its pages were clauses that went far beyond what the surrogate had encountered in other arrangements. The payment schedule was clear, installments spread across the duration of the pregnancy, with a final lump sum, the largest portion, delivered upon completion. That alone was standard practice. But the other stipulations hinted at something more controlling. The surrogate was to adhere to an exact dietary plan, sourced only from approved suppliers. She was forbidden from traveling more than 30 miles from her residence without written consent. She had to submit to weekly medical check-ins, not just from her own doctor, but from a physician approved by Meghan's team. Even her choice of clothing for public outings was subject to guidelines. Nothing that could draw undue attention, no bold prints, or overly glamorous styles. At first, the surrogate brushed these off as quirks of working with someone constantly in the public eye. Privacy was fragile in Meghan's world, and the contract read like an instruction manual for keeping it intact. Yet there was something unsettling about how deeply it intruded into her personal life. Even her social media activity was monitored. She was told to deactivate certain accounts and avoid posting anything that could reveal her location or condition, even to close friends. The non-disclosure agreement was perhaps the most daunting part. It wasn't simply a clause. It was an entire section of the contract, stretching several pages. It prohibited her from speaking not only to journalists, but also to acquaintances who might relay information. The NDA extended beyond the pregnancy itself, in some parts, indefinitely. Any breach, even a perceived one, could trigger severe financial penalties and legal action. Initially, she didn't feel the weight of these restrictions. The payments were arriving on schedule, the gifts were thoughtful, and Meghan's team maintained a cordial tone. She reasoned that following the rules was a small price to pay for the security of the arrangement. But over time, the rigidity of the terms began to feel oppressive. Simple pleasures like meeting an old friend for lunch became complicated. Even trips to the grocery store felt monitored, with Meghan's assistants occasionally checking in unannounced under the guise of wellness visits. One clause stood out in her memory as particularly unsettling. It allowed Meghan's representatives to request immediate relocation if they deemed her current residence a security risk. This wasn't a suggestion, it was binding. The surrogate understood the need for safety, but the idea that she could be told to pack her life into boxes on short notice made her uneasy. The legal language was dense, written in a way that seemed to favor Meghan at every turn. There were vague phrases like any behavior deemed inappropriate by the client that could be used to justify withholding payment. The surrogate had raised questions about these during the initial review, but her concerns had been dismissed with reassurances. It's standard for high-profile arrangements, she was told. No one enforces these unless something extreme happens. Still, as months passed and her relationship with Meghan's team grew more strained, she began to see how these clauses could be weaponized. A late payment could be justified by claiming a breach of conduct. An unexpected expense could be denied reimbursement on the grounds that it was outside the scope of agreed care. The contract that had once seemed like a lifeline now felt like a set of shackles. The surrogate kept a printed copy in a locked drawer, with handwritten notes in the margins. She highlighted parts she feared could be twisted against her. She also kept a separate file, a record of every compliance she maintained, every dietary requirement followed, every appointment attended, every communication approved. If the day ever came when she had to defend herself, she wanted proof that she had upheld her end completely. Behind the clauses and conditions was something else, a power dynamic she couldn't ignore. Meghan wasn't just another client. She was a global figure whose every move attracted headlines. To cross her, or even appear to, could invite a torrent of media scrutiny that would be impossible to escape. The surrogate had entered into the arrangement believing that trust would be mutual. But the further she read and reread the contract, the more she realized it was built to protect one side far more than the other. What unsettled her most was how the language blurred the line between personal and professional. Some clauses read less like legal protections and more like personal preferences codified into law. Meghan's approval wasn't just about safety or privacy. It seemed woven into the fabric of the surrogate's daily existence. It was as if her life had been temporarily absorbed into Meghan's orbit, subject to the same micromanagement and image control that defined Meghan's public brand. By the time payments began to falter, the surrogate could no longer ignore the contract's sharp edges. The strings attached were not merely theoretical. They had the potential to strangle the very security she had counted on. Every email from Meghan's team now carried a subtle threat, the possibility that some obscure clause would be invoked to justify keeping her from the money she was owed. Looking back, she wondered if the seeds of the dispute had been planted from the very beginning. Perhaps the warmth of that first meeting had been a way to ease her into signing something that tilted the balance entirely in Meghan's favor. The contract, in all its detail, was less a partnership and more a leash, and she was starting to feel it tighten. Long before the public caught wind of the dispute, there were murmurs in places where gossip was currency. The first hints didn't come from tabloids or social media sleuths. They came from quiet exchanges among people who worked behind the scenes, people who had been close enough to observe the arrangement yet far enough to speak in low tones without fear of direct reprisal. These whispers painted a picture that the polished public narrative would never allow. It began among a small circle of staff connected to Meghan's wider network: assistants, personal trainers, and a few medical professionals who had either worked with the surrogate or interacted with Meghan during the arrangement. They didn't speak of anything definitive at first, only odd inconsistencies they had noticed. A missed payment here, an unusually tense meeting there. One staffer recalled how Meghan, normally meticulous about managing her calendar, had begun canceling check-in calls with the surrogate at the last minute, replacing them with brief text updates through her team. By the time the surrogate was midway through her term, the whispers had grown more distinct. A former member of Meghan's security detail reportedly mentioned overhearing conversations about tightening costs and re-evaluating the agreement. It was the kind of talk that might seem harmless in a business context, but, in the world of surrogacy, hinted at trouble. In private, the surrogate admitted to feeling a change in tone. What had started as collaborative and respectful was now distant and transactional. Some of these murmurs made their way to mutual acquaintances. One of them, a longtime friend of the surrogate, tried to reassure her. "It's probably just stress," she said. "She's juggling a lot. Don't read into it." But the surrogate couldn't shake the feeling that the shift wasn't just about busyness. It was calculated. The warmth from Meghan had cooled too deliberately, replaced by a careful detachment that felt rehearsed. Inside Meghan's own circle, there were different kinds of whispers. Not everyone in her orbit approved of the surrogacy arrangement. A few felt it was risky, too vulnerable to leaks or betrayal. Others saw it as an investment Meghan could control, as long as the terms were enforced to the letter. One acquaintance allegedly remarked that Meghan had no patience for anyone who didn't deliver exactly as agreed, hinting at a perfectionism that could easily tip into conflict. The surrogate began noticing small changes in how she was treated during routine interactions. A nutritionist who had once chatted warmly with her began keeping things strictly professional, avoiding personal conversation. Meghan's assistants, once quick to respond to her queries, began taking longer to reply, often looping in legal counsel even for minor clarifications. It was as if an invisible wall had gone up between her and the people she had come to trust. The medical staff Meghan had approved for her began showing subtle signs of strain too. One doctor mentioned in passing that they'd been asked to report directly to Meghan's team on every aspect of the surrogate's progress, down to minor mood changes. While such oversight could be explained as concern, it felt invasive, almost as if they were gathering a case file rather than providing care. Then came the first concrete sign that something might be brewing: an overheard conversation during a visit to Meghan's Los Angeles residence. The surrogate had been escorted in through a side entrance to avoid prying eyes. As she waited in a small sitting room, she could hear faint voices in another part of the house. One voice, which she believed to be Meghan's, spoke sharply about liabilities and making sure she stays in line until the end. Another voice, possibly an advisor, responded with something about contractual leverage. The words were muffled, but the tone was unmistakable. She didn't confront Meghan about what she had heard. Confrontation at that point felt too risky, especially given the power imbalance. Instead, she filed the moment away, adding it to her growing list of signs that the arrangement was not as secure as she had believed. The whispers weren't confined to Meghan's camp. Friends of friends began dropping hints in casual conversation, as if testing the waters to see how much the surrogate knew. At a dinner with a mutual acquaintance, someone leaned in and said, "I've heard she's been rethinking things." When pressed, they brushed it off, claiming it was just a rumor. But the seed had been planted. These quiet rumors weren't yet loud enough to be called scandal, but they were enough to create an undercurrent of tension. The surrogate became more guarded in her interactions, careful not to reveal frustration or doubt. She knew that anything she said, even in private, could make its way back to Meghan. And in a world where perception often determined reality, being painted as difficult could be fatal to her chances of receiving what she was owed. By this stage, the surrogate wasn't just aware of the whispers, she was actively trying to decode them. She reached out discreetly to a lawyer, sharing only the vaguest details to avoid breaking her NDA. The lawyer's advice was chilling. If you sense they're building a case against you, document everything. Every call, every message, every appointment. Keep your own timeline. If this goes bad, you'll need more than your word. It was advice she took to heart. From that point forward, she saved every email, kept a backup of every text, and even began recording certain conversations, not with the intention of leaking them, but to protect herself if she was accused of breaching the contract. She knew Meghan's reputation for being strategic, and she suspected that if Meghan wanted to withhold the final payment, she wouldn't do it without a narrative that justified the decision. The whispers, once background noise, had become an alarm bell. And though the world still had no idea what was unfolding, the surrogate could feel the storm gathering. The arrangement, once a promise of mutual benefit, was becoming a silent battle, one that neither side seemed willing to acknowledge publicly, but both were preparing to fight privately. The moment it shifted from unease to undeniable conflict came quietly, without any dramatic announcement or written notice. It was a date the surrogate had circled on her calendar months earlier, the scheduled release of the next installment in her payment plan. By then, she had grown accustomed to delays of a day or two. Meghan's team had always offered explanations, processing delays, transfer issues between banks, or the need for additional verification. But this time, the date came and went with nothing. At first, she gave them the benefit of the doubt. International transactions, especially those involving large sums, could be unpredictable. She sent a polite email to Meghan's assistant, noting that the installment hadn't arrived and asking if there was a timeline for when she could expect it. The reply came 2 days later, oddly curt, stating that the payment was under review and that they would revert with an update. It was the first time she'd heard that phrase, under review, in relation to money already agreed upon and documented in the contract. The days that followed were telling. Communication that had once been warm, even during tense moments, became clipped and overly formal. Her requests for updates were met with short acknowledgments rather than concrete answers. When she pressed further, another assistant, one she had never dealt with before, responded instead of the familiar contact. It felt like a handover, as though Meghan's inner circle had shifted to a defensive posture and wanted a layer of separation between the surrogate and the core team. By the second week, the surrogate began to realize this wasn't a simple delay. The payment wasn't just late, it was being withheld deliberately. The reasoning, when it finally came, was couched in vague language about compliance and pending verification of certain obligations. No specific breaches were cited. No clear timeline was offered. It was a holding pattern designed to keep her waiting without committing to anything. She went back to the contract and read it again, line by line. The clauses on payment were straightforward. As long as she fulfilled her duties, attending medical checkups, following the agreed health guidelines, and maintaining confidentiality, the installments were due in full. She had complied with every requirement, often at personal inconvenience, sometimes even beyond what was necessary. The idea that she was somehow failing to meet the agreement felt like a manufactured excuse. The withheld payment quickly became more than an inconvenience. It disrupted her ability to keep up with personal bills, medical expenses, and the adjustments she had made to her life to meet Meghan's strict requirements. She had taken a leave from her usual work, reduced her public presence, and arranged her entire routine around the terms of the surrogacy. The missing funds were not only unfair, they were destabilizing. Her first instinct was to reach out directly to Meghan, bypassing the intermediaries who were stonewalling her. But those messages went unanswered. Calls were either ignored or redirected to an assistant. The shift in communication was stark. Where Meghan had once sent occasional personal notes or voice messages, there was now nothing but filtered statements from staff. It was as if Meghan had decided to remove herself entirely from the arrangement, leaving her team to handle and delay the matter. The surrogate began to suspect this was not an isolated incident, but a test. If she accepted the delay without protest, it could set a precedent for further withholding. And if Meghan's team intended to reduce or eliminate the final payment, this was the soft launch of that plan, a way to gauge how far they could push before she resisted. 2 more weeks passed without resolution. When the surrogate pressed harder, she received a reply that was both patronizing and ominous. As you know, these arrangements require trust and flexibility. We are currently reviewing certain conduct to ensure all aspects align with the spirit of our agreement. That single word, conduct, stood out like a warning shot. She understood immediately that they were preparing to claim she had breached some term, even if they had to stretch the definition to make it fit. She thought about the whispered warnings she had been hearing for weeks, about liabilities, about leverage. They no longer felt like idle chatter. They felt like the outline of a plan already in motion. Meghan's camp had the resources to draw this out for months, even years, if necessary. And the longer they withheld payment, the more pressure they could exert on her to accept a reduced settlement or walk away entirely. Her lawyer advised her to remain calm and not to escalate publicly, at least not yet. But he also instructed her to formally request in writing a clear explanation for the delay and a specific payment date. The surrogate sent the request, keeping her tone professional but firm. It was met with silence for nearly a week, and when the reply came, it was a recycled statement about review processes and ongoing evaluations. By now, the surrogate's trust was gone. She began keeping a detailed journal of every interaction, dates, times, and exact wording. She knew that if this turned into a legal fight, the precision of her records could make the difference. But more than that, the act of documenting gave her a sense of control in a situation where control was slipping away. What stung most was not just the absence of money, but the absence of basic respect. The arrangement had been sold to her as a partnership built on trust and gratitude. Instead, she felt like an expendable service provider being managed into submission. Each delayed response, each vague excuse, was a reminder that in Meghan's world, agreements could be bent if it suited the narrative or the bottom line. And yet, part of her still hoped it was a misunderstanding, that Meghan, caught up in other matters, wasn't fully aware of how her team was handling things. But hope was a fragile thing now. The reality was that the payments had stopped, the relationship had cooled, and the surrogate was standing at the edge of a decision she knew could change everything. The missed payment wasn't just a late deposit. It was the turning point. From here on, she understood, the situation was no longer about fulfilling a contract. It was about defending herself in a power struggle she had never wanted but could no longer avoid. The first real confrontation happened on a gray Thursday morning, when the surrogate decided she could no longer rely on carefully worded emails and delayed responses. She called Meghan's personal line, a number given to her in the early stages of the arrangement, back when trust was still intact. To her surprise, Meghan answered. There was no pleasantry, no warm greeting, just a clipped hello that carried an edge. The surrogate didn't waste time. She explained that the payment was now over a month late, that she had complied with every term of the contract, and that she needed a direct answer about when it would be made. Meghan listened without interruption, but her silence was not passive. It was heavy, deliberate. When she finally spoke, her words were calculated. It's not that simple, she said. We've had concerns brought to our attention, and until those are addressed, we can't proceed. The surrogate asked what concerns she was referring to. Meghan's tone shifted from restrained to defensive. There have been questions about discretion, about certain behaviors that don't align with what we agreed. I'm not saying you broke the contract, but things have to be reviewed. It was the first time Meghan had hinted at alleged breaches directly. The surrogate's voice stayed calm, but her hands trembled. She asked for specifics, examples of what she had supposedly done wrong. Meghan deflected, saying her team would compile the details and be in touch. Then came the statement that felt like a veiled threat. I want this to end well for both of us, but you need to remember there are consequences for how this plays out. That phrase lingered in the surrogate's mind long after the call ended. Consequences. She knew Meghan had the means to enforce her will, legal teams, media influence, and a global platform. But the call also revealed something else. Meghan was now directly involved in the decision to delay payment, which shattered any illusion that the delays were merely her team's doing. 2 days later, an official letter arrived via courier. It was from Meghan's legal representatives, formally stating that certain contractual obligations are currently under evaluation and that payment will be suspended until these matters are resolved. The language was clinical, but the intent was clear. They were building a case to justify withholding the money indefinitely. The letter also reminded the surrogate of the strict NDA and warned that any disclosure of this correspondence, its contents, or the nature of the dispute could trigger immediate legal action. The surrogate read it twice, feeling the walls close in. This was no longer about negotiation. It was about control. The late-night thoughts she had tried to push aside came rushing back. The whispered conversations she'd overheard, the sudden change in tone from Meghan's staff, the hints that her conduct was being quietly monitored. It all pointed to one conclusion. They were setting her up to either walk away or accept a reduced payout. Still, she wasn't ready to back down. She responded through her lawyer, firmly stating that she had fulfilled every requirement and demanding a detailed explanation of the alleged concerns. She also requested proof of any supposed breach. The reply, when it came, was vague and evasive, references to patterns of behavior and potential reputational risks without a single concrete example. Privately, her lawyer told her this was a common tactic in high-profile disputes. Keep the accusations nonspecific, force the other party to defend themselves against shadows, and draw out the process until they either run out of resources or give up. In this case, the surrogate's resources were limited. Every day, without payment, increased the pressure on her. The emotional toll was as sharp as the financial one. She began to dread every phone call, every email. Each new message from Meghan's camp felt like another turn of the screw. Friends noticed the change in her. She was quieter, more guarded, her laughter forced. When asked what was wrong, she lied, citing stress from work commitments and family matters. The NDA loomed over her like a constant threat, making even casual conversation feel dangerous. But there was another kind of pressure building too, one Meghan's team hadn't counted on. The surrogate had begun to share carefully curated pieces of her situation with a very small group of trusted confidants, people outside Meghan's sphere of influence. She didn't tell them names or details that could violate her NDA, but she told enough for them to understand the weight of what she was facing. One of these confidants happened to have connections in the media, and they hinted, gently, almost as a question, that if push came to shove, there were ways to get her story out without her being the direct source. For now, the surrogate kept that card in her pocket. But she knew that if Meghan's team escalated the threats or tried to smear her publicly, she might have no choice but to play it. The final push in this chapter came during a second direct conversation with Meghan, weeks after the first. This time, Meghan's tone was sharper from the start. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," she said. "If you want this resolved, you have to work with us, not against us." The surrogate replied that she had been working with them for months and that she just wanted what she was owed. Meghan sighed audibly before saying, "You have no idea how much damage you could cause if you make the wrong move here. Think about that." The call ended with no resolution, but the surrogate understood the message. Meghan wasn't just protecting money. She was protecting an image, and anyone who threatened that image, intentionally or not, would face the full weight of her defense. The battle lines were no longer invisible. They had been drawn in the open, behind closed doors where the public couldn't see, yet. And the surrogate was beginning to realize that if she wanted any chance of winning, she would need to take the fight beyond those closed doors. From the moment the arrangement began, Prince Harry had been a distant figure in the surrogate story. He wasn't the one handling contracts, overseeing payments, or dictating dietary rules. But his presence was always there in the background, a shadow in every decision Meghan made. Whether he was an active participant in the negotiations or merely an informed bystander remained unclear to the surrogate in the early days. By the time the dispute over payment surfaced, she was beginning to suspect that Harry's role was far more complicated than anyone on Meghan's team wanted to admit. Her first direct encounter with him had been brief, a casual introduction during one of Meghan's early in-person check-ins. He had been polite, even warm, asking about her comfort and whether she was getting the care she needed. It felt genuine enough at the time. He didn't linger in the conversation, leaving Meghan to lead, but there was an air of sincerity in his tone that reassured her. That brief meeting was the only time she had seen him without the filter of assistants or legal representatives. After that, Harry's involvement was subtle, often limited to overheard comments or secondhand references. Meghan would occasionally mention, "Harry and I discussed this," or "Harry thinks we should do it this way," particularly when changes were made to her schedule or care routine. At first, the surrogate assumed these were the normal dynamics of a couple making decisions together. But as the payments began to falter, she began to question whether Harry was aware of the growing tension, and if so, why he wasn't stepping in to resolve it. The first indication that he might be aware came during a phone call that Meghan took in the surrogate's presence. It was on speakerphone, and though the surrogate tried to keep her attention on her tea, she couldn't help but hear. Meghan was updating Harry on the situation, her voice lower than usual. Harry's responses were short. "Okay, right, got it." At one point, Meghan said, "She's starting to ask more questions. We have to be careful how we handle this." There was a pause, and then Harry replied, "Just make sure everything's tight. No loose ends." That exchange stayed with the surrogate for weeks. It wasn't overtly incriminating, but it suggested a level of awareness that went beyond casual knowledge. He wasn't in the dark. He knew there were issues, and his advice, if it could be called that, leaned toward containment rather than resolution. From then on, she began to notice how Harry's name would surface in moments of negotiation. If Meghan's team wanted to shut down a discussion, they would say, "Harry's agreed this is the best approach," as though invoking his approval made their position final. It was hard to tell if this was genuine or simply a tactic to apply pressure, but the effect was the same. It signaled that the dispute wasn't just with Meghan, but potentially with both of them. Some of Meghan's defenders have argued that Harry was likely shielded from the finer details of the arrangement, that Meghan managed the matter independently to spare him the stress. But the surrogate found it difficult to believe. The scale of the agreement, the money involved, and the potential legal implications were too significant for a spouse not to be at least informed. And if he was informed, his continued silence suggested complicity. There was also the matter of the public image. By the time whispers of the dispute began circulating in certain media circles, Harry was making appearances alongside Meghan at charity events and interviews, presenting an image of unity and shared purpose. If he knew there was a serious conflict brewing behind the scenes, he gave no sign of it publicly. The contrast between that polished image and the reality the surrogate was experiencing only deepened her sense of frustration. Privately, she wondered whether Harry viewed the situation as just another PR risk to be managed. He had spent years navigating media storms, often alongside Meghan, and had learned to treat negative narratives as threats to be neutralized rather than truths to be confronted. If that was his perspective, then siding with Meghan, or at least allowing her to handle it in her own way, would be the path of least resistance. The closest the surrogate came to direct confirmation of Harry's stance was through a mutual contact who had once worked closely with him. Over coffee, the contact admitted, "Harry's aware there's tension. But from what I hear, he's trusting Meghan to deal with it. He doesn't want to get dragged into the weeds." The surrogate asked if that meant he would intervene if things escalated. The contact hesitated before saying, "Honestly, probably not unless it becomes a full-blown scandal." That statement was both clarifying and chilling. It confirmed what she had begun to suspect, that unless she forced the issue into the public eye, Harry would remain on the sidelines. He wasn't going to step in to mediate. He wasn't going to ensure she was paid. His priority was to protect the brand he and Meghan had built since leaving the royal family, and anything that threatened that brand would be managed with image, not accountability. The more she thought about it, the more she saw Harry's silence as a form of action. By not intervening, he was allowing Meghan's team to press forward with their strategy. Whether he believed her claims or not was irrelevant. His absence from the negotiations sent a clear signal. The surrogate's fight was not just with Meghan, it was with a united front. And yet, there was a small part of her that wondered if Harry ever questioned the ethics of what was happening. In quiet moments, she imagined him hearing a version of her story from someone else, someone he trusted, and feeling a flicker of doubt. But that was speculation, and speculation wouldn't pay her what she was owed. What was certain was that he was aware, and he had chosen not to act. By the time she reached this conclusion, the surrogate had stopped hoping for Harry's intervention. Instead, she began preparing for the next stage, one where she would have to push back harder, even if it meant dragging both of their names into the public conversation. Because whether Harry was a silent witness or a co-conspirator, his silence had consequences, and she was no longer willing to bear them alone. It happened on a day when she had finally grown tired of waiting for someone else to do the right thing. Weeks had turned into months, and the polite reminders, formal legal letters, and tense phone calls had gone nowhere. The final payment remained unpaid. The accusations from Meghan's team continued to float in vague, unsubstantiated terms, and her life was now consumed by the uncertainty of whether she would ever see the money she was owed. The surrogate had been warned repeatedly about the dangers of speaking out. The NDA loomed like a silent enforcer, a constant reminder that one wrong word could unleash a wave of legal retaliation. But what Meghan's team hadn't accounted for was the fact that pressure can only build for so long before it demands a release. She had been living under their conditions, bound by their narrative, and deprived of the fairness she had been promised. At a certain point, silence felt less like protection and more like surrender. Her decision to break that silence wasn't impulsive. She didn't wake up one morning and decide to expose everything. It was the result of weeks of careful planning and weighing the risks. She knew that if she went public recklessly, Meghan's team would move fast to discredit her. She would need to control the narrative from the start, to frame her story not as an attack, but as a demand for accountability. She chose her platform carefully. Not a gossip outlet hungry for scandal, not a social media rant that could be dismissed as emotional outburst, but a measured, credible interview with a journalist known for thoroughness and discretion. Before she agreed to sit down with them, she made sure they understood the stakes. She would share her experience in a way that did not breach the most sensitive NDA provisions, but would still make her claims unmistakably clear. The interview was conducted in a quiet, private location. No flashy cameras, no stylists, no stage set, just a recorder on the table and 2 chairs. She began not with accusations, but with the story of how she had been approached for the arrangement, the promises made, the trust she had extended, and how that trust had been eroded over time. Her tone was calm, deliberate, and unflinching. When she reached the part about the unpaid $500,000, her voice shifted slightly. It wasn't anger that came through, it was resolve. She explained the payment schedule, how each installment had been received on time until the later stages, and how communication had changed once the money stopped. She detailed the vague accusations of conduct issues, the refusal to provide specific evidence, and the repeated assurances that the matter was under review without any progress. What made the interview so compelling was the way she intertwined the financial dispute with the emotional reality of the experience. She spoke about how she had restructured her life to comply with Meghan's contract. The restrictions on travel, the monitored diet, the loss of privacy. She described the isolation of not being able to talk openly with friends and family, the anxiety of every delayed email, and the constant fear that one misinterpreted action could be used against her. The journalist asked if she believed Meghan was personally behind the decision to withhold the payment or if it was the work of her team. The surrogate paused before answering. "It doesn't matter whose idea it was," she said finally. "She's the one who signed the contract. She's the one who promised to honor it. At the end of the day, she's responsible." That single line would later become the quote most widely repeated when the interview was published. It captured the essence of her position. This wasn't about grudges or media narratives. It was about accountability, plain and simple. She stopped short of revealing every detail she knew. There were things she held back intentionally, both to protect herself legally and to keep certain leverage for future negotiations. But what she did reveal was enough to ignite interest. The journalist didn't name Meghan outright in the headline, but the description was so specific that anyone paying attention knew exactly who the surrogate was referring to. The interview went live late on a Tuesday evening. By Wednesday morning, it was everywhere. Online forums dissected every sentence, tabloids pounced on the story, and mainstream outlets began reaching out to Meghan's representatives for comment. The response from Meghan's camp was swift, a short statement calling the allegations categorically false and accusing the surrogate of breaching confidentiality agreements. They framed her as a disgruntled former associate whose claims were designed to generate attention and leverage for personal gain. But the surrogate had anticipated this. She had prepared documentation, bank records showing missed payments, copies of the correspondence where Meghan's team acknowledged the outstanding balance, and medical receipts tied to the arrangement. She didn't release them all at once. Instead, she provided just enough proof to back her story without revealing every piece of evidence she had. This made her seem credible without exhausting her ammunition. The public reaction was split. Meghan's staunch supporters accused the surrogate of cashing in on Meghan's fame. Others, especially those critical of Meghan's past controversies, saw it as another example of her exploiting someone for personal benefit. The most important thing for the surrogate, however, was that the conversation had shifted. No longer was she the silent, faceless party in a private dispute. She now had a voice, and her version of events was in the public record. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Offers for more interviews poured in. Some came from outlets she wouldn't touch, fearing they would sensationalize her story beyond recognition. Others came from major networks offering primetime slots. Her lawyer advised caution, reminding her that the more she spoke, the greater the risk of triggering aggressive legal action from Meghan's camp. Still, the surrogate knew she had crossed a line she could never step back from. Silence was no longer an option. Breaking her silence had been the riskiest move she'd ever made. But as she watched her words ripple through the news cycle, she felt a shift. The power dynamic had changed. Meghan's team could still threaten and deny, but they could no longer control the narrative completely. The surrogate had claimed her place in the story, and for the first time, she felt like she was no longer just reacting to Meghan's moves. She was making her own. Once the interview went public, the pressure on both sides intensified. Meghan's team doubled down on denials, framing the surrogate's claims as misleading and unfounded. But what Meghan's camp had underestimated was that the surrogate hadn't come forward empty-handed. She had anticipated this exact moment months ago, quietly collecting proof, tangible, verifiable evidence that could withstand public and legal scrutiny. It began with the contract itself, a thick, meticulously drafted document. It carried Meghan's signature in bold ink, alongside that of the surrogate and their respective legal representatives. Every term, from payment schedules to behavioral restrictions, was laid out in precise legal language. The surrogate had annotated her copy in the margins, noting the dates certain conditions were met and the circumstances surrounding them. The clauses about payment were clear: installment dates, amounts, and the final lump sum upon completion of the arrangement. There was no ambiguous language in those sections, no loopholes that could justify non-payment if she had fulfilled her obligations. The surrogate's lawyer advised her to release only excerpts of the contract, enough to show the payment obligations, but not enough to reveal every personal detail or clause that could later be twisted against her. In those released excerpts, the payment timeline stood out starkly. Each installment had a date and a specific amount. The final $500,000 was to be wired within 2 weeks of the delivery, contingent only on the surrogate maintaining confidentiality and adhering to the agreed care requirements. But the contract was just the start. The surrogate also had a series of emails exchanged between herself and Meghan's assistants. These messages were polite at first, thanking her for her dedication and commitment to the process. But as time went on, the tone shifted. The once warm greetings gave way to clipped responses, vague reassurances, and eventually, outright avoidance. One particularly telling email, dated just after the final payment was due, came from Meghan's senior assistant. It read, "As you are aware, the final installment is currently on hold pending internal review of certain matters. We appreciate your patience during this time." The surrogate's reply had been calm but firm. "Please specify which matters are under review." "I have complied fully with the terms of the contract, and I require a definitive timeline for payment." The assistant never addressed the question directly, instead responding with a generic message.